It was a quiet, unremarkable day. The phone rang, just another call at the end of a long workday. But this time it wasn't a routine check-in. It wasn't Ray's deep voice on the line, the kind that always had a hint of humor even when the highway miles were dragging on. Instead, there was a cold, unsettling silence. Just a handful of words. "If I don't call you back in 30 minutes, call the police. Someone's following me." And then the line went dead. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. In Council Bluffs, Iowa, everything had its place. The rhythm of the town was steady, like the rustling of leaves in the oak trees that lined the streets or the slow roll of traffic across the Missouri River into Omaha. Mornings were quiet, the soft hum of the town just beginning to stir. Karen Mitchell Ray's wife would start the coffee before the sun even peeked over the horizon. It was a ritual familiar and comforting, like the worn kitchen table where they had shared countless mornings and the evenings just the same. Ray had been a trucker for over 25 years, steady, reliable, never once late. He lived by the road, knowing its twists and turns like the back of his hand. If Ray said he was going to be home by Friday, he would be. Always. Karen, his partner in life, had her own quiet rhythms. A part-time library assistant, she had a knack for finding the right book for anyone who walked through the door. Her life, like Ray's, was built on a foundation of dependability. Their home, tucked into the small two-bedroom house in Council Bluffs, was modest but warm. The kind of place where the door was always open, where the neighborhood kids knew they could knock for a glass of water or a cookie. In March 1998, Ray had just turned 49. He had earned his reputation not by being flashy, but by being there time and time again. His route was simple: Omaha to Denver and back. Interstate 80. The same road, the same truck stops. He knew the best diners and the cleanest restrooms. He knew where to fuel up and where to stop for a break. No complaints, no drama. The night before his trip, everything had been just like always. Ray came home after work and they shared a quiet dinner. Pot roast, his favorite. They watched some TV and later they joked about who would win at trivia. Ray always had a knack for geography. By 9 p.m. he was ready for bed, his body already conditioned to the long hours ahead. Karen stayed up reading something light. They said their good nights and nothing felt out of the ordinary. At 3:30 a.m. on March 19th, Ray's alarm clock pulled him from sleep. He was used to this. He moved quietly around the house, showering, making coffee, getting ready for the road. Karen, half asleep, gave him the usual send-off. "Drive safe, love you," she said. Ray, always steady, kissed her cheek and replied, "Same thing." But as much as he was steady that morning, there was something in the air that felt off. Ray pulled out of the driveway and drove toward the Johnson transport yard just like every other day. His route was laid out before him, simple. But things rarely stay simple, and no one ever really knows when their last day will be. And for Ray Mitchell that morning, the morning that felt like any other, would end in a way no one could have predicted. By 2:24 p.m. that afternoon, his truck was found abandoned on the shoulder of Interstate 80. The engine was running, the coffee cup still full in the cup holder. His logbook sat on the passenger seat, a half-eaten burrito wrapped in paper. No Ray, no sign of where he went. The highway stretched on for miles in every direction, silent. And then there was the CB radio. The one that had gone silent with the last words Ray had spoken to his wife, words that would haunt her for years. Where was Ray Mitchell? What had happened in those fleeting, silent minutes? Ray had disappeared. And somewhere deep in the Nebraska earth, the answers had already begun to settle in. The first few days of the search for Ray Mitchell felt surreal. When I think back to it now, I can still remember the steady, rhythmic hum of the search teams, the voices on the radio, the constant chatter, and the sense of urgency mixed with uncertainty. The work had to go on, but there was something hollow in the air. It was a case that everyone in the Nebraska State Police knew, and no one had ever forgotten about it. But when you're dealing with something as jarring as a trucker disappearing from a highway like that, the mind can't help but go into a strange denial. Not that anyone said it outright, but that's the only way I can describe it now, this quiet refusal to believe something so ordinary, so routine, could be so utterly disrupted. When Ray's wife, Karen, called that afternoon, I could hear the worry in her voice. But it was not the panicked sort of worry you might expect from someone whose husband has been gone for hours. Karen sounded steady, almost too steady, like she was holding herself together. But something in her words made me think she already knew deep down that this wasn't just a case of Ray taking an unexpected detour. The silence on the other end of the phone was thick with it, like she was already running ahead of the investigation, trying to make sense of a world that was about to fall apart. I remember the truck being found by Dale Carson, another driver who'd known Ray over the years. When I first heard about it, my mind didn't quite catch up to the meaning of it. Ray's truck sitting there on the shoulder with the engine running, the door ajar, the coffee cup still on the dashboard. In hindsight, that scene stands out, the strange quiet of it. There's something eerie about an engine that runs without a driver, a trucker's truck with no trucker in sight. You know something's wrong, but there's no clear explanation. You have to tell yourself over and over that everything's fine, even as your gut screams that it's not. What struck me the most, even before we started to dig deeper, was how everything about Ray's truck was almost too normal. There were no signs of struggle. The trip log was still on the dashboard, his wallet in the cup holder. His half-eaten burrito sat on the passenger seat, a familiar scene of the kind of routine I'd seen 100 times. But there was one thing that didn't sit right, a piece of the puzzle that stuck in my mind. His CB radio. The microphone was missing, ripped from its cord. You don't just pull a mic out like that unless you're in a hurry. And then there was the part of the story that still didn't make sense. Someone had heard Ray's final transmission. Got a situation here. Don't follow me off the... The voice on the other end, Dale's, had heard that. But what did Ray mean by it? Was he warning someone else? Or was it meant for the person following him? And what about the disappearance? 32 minutes. In that short span of time, a whole life had vanished. No trace of Ray, just a truck left standing. It was as if the world had swallowed him up. The search had begun in earnest after the truck was found, and I was assigned to follow the case. I remember the way the fields looked that first day. It was early spring, and the Nebraska sky was that pale blue stretching forever above the flat open land. The breeze was gentle, but it carried the scent of fresh earth and grass. We covered every inch of ground within a 10-mile radius of where Ray's truck had been abandoned. We had helicopters, search dogs, volunteers who came in from nearby towns, but nothing that made sense. And then, when it seemed like we were running out of leads, that's when the dig started. A routine highway construction project not far from where Ray's truck had been found was about to turn everything we thought we knew upside down. It was a standard job, a trench for a drainage system. Nothing unusual except for the fact that the bucket on the excavator hit something that didn't belong. Mike Torres was operating the machine just another day at work when that strange sound, a metallic scrape, cut through the routine noise of the machinery. He'd been digging all day, the kind of mind-numbing, repetitive work that forces you to focus on every movement to keep from zoning out. But this sound, it wasn't just dirt hitting metal. It was something else. Something foreign. Mike climbed down from the cab and called over his crew chief, Danny Reeves. Danny had been around for years and had seen a lot in his time, but even he paused when he saw what was buried in the red soil. It wasn't a rock or a piece of debris. It was a CB radio wrapped carefully in a denim jacket with the faded logo of Johnson Transport stitched on it. Danny brushed the dirt off carefully, and they both looked at each other silently, aware that something wasn't right. The jacket, the radio, it wasn't just buried by accident. It had been placed there. Mike called the police, and within hours, Trooper Jeff Manning arrived at the site. Trooper Manning had been with the force long enough to have seen a fair share of strange things, But when he stood there looking at the buried items, he knew it wasn't the usual lost property or stolen goods that were dumped along highways. It was something more. They took everything into evidence, and I remember hearing the quiet click of the bag being sealed. There was something final about that sound. They took the items to the forensics lab in Lincoln, and I had no idea that what we'd found buried beneath the soil would set in motion a chain of events that would answer questions no one had dared ask for years. The radio, though old, still had a serial number on it, one that led directly to Johnson Transport and a driver named Ray Mitchell, the same Ray Mitchell who had disappeared 22 years ago. It was a name I'd heard too many times over the years, a case everyone had whispered about but never solved. Forensics confirmed that the radio had been buried for decades, at least 20 years. It had been left to degrade forgotten, but now it was all coming back to life. I couldn't help but think of Karen Mitchell somewhere out there wondering why she hadn't heard from her husband that day. I thought about that phone call, the one where Ray had said someone was following him, that final message to his wife. And then the realization hit me. Ray hadn't just disappeared. Something had happened to him, something far darker than anyone had expected. But we still had no answers. Only pieces, shards of a story that seemed too strange to be true. And yet in that moment, I knew we were getting closer. The silence around Ray Mitchell's disappearance had been broken. But the truth, what had really happened to him on that stretch of Interstate 80, was still buried, waiting to be uncovered. By the time the case reached me, it felt like something distant, an open wound no one had bothered to close. Ray Mitchell's disappearance had lingered in the quiet corners of the Nebraska State Police files for more than 2 decades. I'd heard his name whispered in passing in brief moments of silence at the end of other investigations. There was never any closure, just a heavy question mark that hung over it like a fog that no one could disperse. But when I picked up the file in June 2020, I knew things had shifted. We had a piece of evidence now, a clue that should have been buried long ago and that somehow made all the difference. I remember the weight of that radio in my hands. It was weathered, the plastic cracked, the once bright chrome knobs rusted. It had been down there for years, buried in the soil, waiting. The serial number, barely legible from the corrosion, was a key one that unlocked a mystery so many had tried to forget. Johnson Transport, Ray Mitchell. The connection was undeniable, but as I held that radio, all I could feel was the unanswered question. What had happened to Ray? I spent hours staring at the evidence in front of me, trying to pull the pieces together. The radio was an object, yes, but more than that, it was a tether to the man who had gone missing. And when the forensic lab confirmed that it had been buried for at least 20 years, I felt a chill. Everything about this was wrong. It wasn't just the buried radio or the missing trucker. It was the way his life had been erased from the map. No answers, no body, just the same questions repeated over and over again. The timeline had been stuck for too long, but not anymore. The more I thought about Ray's life, the kind of steady, dependable man he'd been, the more I understood how much had been stolen from his family, from his community. This wasn't just about a trucker who disappeared. This was about a husband, a father, a guy who'd driven the same stretch of road for 25 years without incident. And now here we were with a CB radio and a jacket buried together, holding secrets that only the earth knew for 2 decades. I had to go back to the beginning. Ray's morning, March 19th, 1998. The phone call with Karen. Someone's following me. The strange, quick transmission, and then silence. All of it haunted me. No one had ever been able to explain those last few moments, those 32 minutes between Ray's call and the moment his truck was found abandoned. At first, there was the assumption Ray had gone off track somehow. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown. That was the easiest theory to cling to. But something about the way he had spoken to Karen, the way he said, "If I don't call you back in 30 minutes, call the police," that didn't sound like a man who was confused. That sounded like someone who knew something was wrong. It sounded like a man who knew his life was in danger. And then there was the last transmission. The last thing Ray had said on that CB radio before it went silent. "Don't follow me off the..." The unfinished words hung in the air for days. What had he been trying to say? Why had he been so urgent? What had he known that no one else had? I dug deeper into the case file, rereading everything from the initial report to the interview transcripts. Every word seemed to pull me further into the past. I read the statement from Ray's dispatcher, Tom Hendress, who recalled the last time he'd spoken to Ray. At 1:45 p.m., Ray had checked in. Everything was fine, no problems. But just a few minutes later, something had changed. And then there was Dale Carson, another trucker who had been driving that afternoon just east of Ray on I-80. He had heard Ray's transmission on Channel 19, just a few words, a strange crackle of interference, and then the silence. Dale had tried calling Ray back, but there was no response. It was unsettling to think that in a way Ray had called out for help, but no one had heard him in time. I needed to understand what had happened between that transmission and the discovery of Ray's truck. I had to dig into every detail, no matter how small. I thought about Lyle Garrett. At first, I had dismissed him as just another name, someone tangential to the story, but nothing more. But as I worked through the timeline, the more I realized that everything pointed to him. The connection wasn't obvious at first, but it was there. In 1995, Ray had reported Garrett for siphoning fuel from his truck at a truck stop. That incident, small as it might have seemed at the time, had sparked a grudge. And now here I was, thinking back to that moment, trying to make sense of it all. Could it really be that something as small as a stolen gallon of diesel had led to this? Lyle Garrett had a history, one that wasn't just about petty theft. There were violent tendencies there, an assault charge, a history of confrontation with other truckers, including Dale Carson. And now Garrett was in the picture again, this time in connection with Ray's disappearance. It wasn't just that Ray had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was something deliberate about it, something planned. I started thinking about Lyle's whereabouts on the day Ray went missing. It turned out he had been working for Hammond Ranch just a few miles away from where Ray's truck was found. And Lyle had a history of fence line maintenance along that stretch of highway. The pieces fit too neatly. As I followed the trail, I found myself standing on the side of the highway just yards from where Ray's truck had been found. I looked out over the open fields, the same fields where Ray had disappeared. The land was flat, stretching endlessly into the distance, and I realized just how easy it would have been to disappear out there, to bury something or someone and leave no trace. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were getting closer, but we still didn't have the one thing we needed evidence. Lyle Garrett was long dead. There was no way to question him, no way to confront him about what happened that afternoon. But the evidence, the timeline, the connection between Ray and Lyle was starting to add up in a way that couldn't be ignored. And so I went back to the beginning, digging deeper, asking questions that no one had thought to ask in years. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about finding out what had really happened to Ray Mitchell and giving his family the answer they'd waited for, whether they were ready for it or not. But there was something else, too. A feeling that Ray's death was just the beginning of something far bigger, a secret that had been buried for far too long, waiting to be unearthed. The days stretched on, each one passing in a haze of routine and expectation. I remember staring at the map, tracing Ray's last known movements along Interstate 80, trying to map out a path in my mind that would make sense of everything. But nothing fit. Ray had just vanished into thin air, and as the days turned into weeks and then months, the weight of that silence pressed down on everyone involved. I knew the case had gone cold, but there was still something gnawing at me, pulling me back to it again and again. It was one of those cases that gets under your skin, the kind that you don't forget no matter how hard you try. We had a name now, Lyle Garrett, and with that a new thread to pull at. But the more I dug into Lyle's history, the more unsettling the connections became. Lyle wasn't just a random name in a police report. No, there was more to it than that. There was history here, a tangled web of small incidents and grudges that had been simmering for years. In 1995, Lyle had been caught siphoning diesel from Ray's truck at a truck stop, and Ray had been the one to report it. At the time, it probably seemed like just another minor theft, a nuisance for a trucker, nothing more. But in the years that followed, it was clear that the theft had left more than just a dent in the truck's fuel tank. It had left a scar. Lyle had never forgotten it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever had happened between Ray and Lyle had set something in motion. It had built a resentment that would fester over time, turning into something far darker than anyone had anticipated. Lyle Garrett, born and raised in Nebraska, had a history of violent encounters with other truckers' incidents that never made headlines but left scars all the same. He'd been arrested for assault once after a confrontation with a trucker at a rest stop, and there were rumors of his volatile temper and disregard for authority. He wasn't just another guy on the side of the road. He was someone with a deep-seated anger, someone who had already crossed lines long before Ray ever made that call to Karen. The more I pieced together, the more Lyle's life seemed to orbit Ray's. They were connected more than anyone had realized. In the months leading up to Ray's disappearance, Lyle had been working near the area where Ray's truck was found. He was doing fence line maintenance for Hammond Ranch, just a few miles from I-80. I pulled the maps and ran the numbers. The locations lined up perfectly. Lyle had the motive, the opportunity, and the grudge. And as I stood there looking out over the same stretch of highway where Ray had vanished, the pieces finally started to come together. But even with all these connections, there was still something missing. We had no physical evidence linking Lyle to Ray's disappearance, not yet. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but no smoking gun. I needed more, and I knew that somewhere buried beneath the weight of those 22 years was something that could finally tip the scales. That's when I called in the dogs. I'd heard about a construction project taking place not far from the spot where Ray's truck had been found, and I knew that if we were going to find anything, it had to be now. The site had been disturbed recently, and it was the kind of place where something hidden could easily be uncovered. I sent a team with cadaver dogs, 3 German shepherds specially trained to detect human decomposition even after decades. I'll never forget the quiet anticipation of those days. The way the air felt different, charged with something electric as the dogs began their search. The ground was still soft, the earth freshly disturbed by the construction equipment. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find much, but I had a feeling we were getting closer. The dogs worked in a grid pattern covering every inch of the site. They sniffed the ground, their noses twitching as they moved in tight circles focused on something just out of reach. And then, at 2:15 p.m. on June 24th, it happened. All 3 dogs stopped at the same spot 12 feet away from where the CB radio had been unearthed. They sat down, their bodies stiff with focus, their eyes locked on the ground beneath them. I couldn't help but feel a lump form in my throat as I stepped forward. This was it. This was the moment that would either bring us closer to the truth or leave us still searching in the dark. I gave the command to start digging. The excavation was slow, careful. We couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. I watched as the crew slowly uncovered more denim, another jacket just like the one that had wrapped Ray's radio. It was stained with the same earth, the same soil. And then there it was, bone. The unmistakable whiteness of human remains, half buried and forgotten, waiting to be found. I remember the stillness of that moment, the sound of the shovel cutting into the earth, the rustling of the wind in the grass. The world felt quieter somehow, as if it too was holding its breath. We were all standing at the edge of something much larger than a simple investigation. This wasn't just about finding a missing person anymore. It was about unraveling a dark secret that had been buried for more than 2 decades. When the forensic anthropologist, Dr. Patricia Holland examined the remains on site. She confirmed what we already feared. The bones were those of a man between 45 and 55 years old, right in the range for Ray Mitchell. The burial site had been undisturbed for years, but the soil composition, the way the bones were positioned, all pointed to one thing: Ray Mitchell had been murdered. Dr. Holland identified 2 distinct points of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Someone had struck him twice with a heavy cylindrical object. I could feel the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't an accident. Ray hadn't just disappeared. He'd been killed. And the burial separate from the radio, the jacket wrapped carefully around his body, told us something more. Whoever had done this, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that radio was evidence that Ray's last words had been broadcast to everyone on that stretch of I-80, and they knew they couldn't leave that behind. I stood there for a long time, staring at the bones, at the life that had once been so steady and certain, now reduced to fragments of evidence. We had what we needed now. The truth had been waiting for us buried in the earth all this time. But even as I stood there, something nagged at me. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was still so much we didn't know. Why bury the radio separately? Why was Ray's last transmission so urgent? And who else had been involved in this? I felt the tension in the air, the kind that only comes when you know you're on the brink of something big. And as we wrapped up the scene, I couldn't help but wonder how much of Ray's story had been hidden for all these years. How many more secrets would come to light once we started pulling on this thread? The search wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. But now we had the one thing we needed proof. We had Ray Mitchell's remains, his final words, and a killer whose name had been buried in the past. Now we just had to put it all together. The day the case was officially closed, I sat at my desk and looked out the window. It had been a long time since I'd felt this kind of weight lift. But the truth is, it wasn't really a relief. It was something else, more like a deep, quiet exhale, the kind you take when you know there's nothing left to do but honor what you've found. It was the finality that gets you the moment when you realize that even though everything has been laid bare, there's still a piece of the story that will never come back. Ray Mitchell was finally at peace, but for those of us left behind, that peace was hard-earned, and it felt like it would always be just a little bit too far out of reach. We had found the man responsible. Lyle Garrett, the man who'd harbored a grudge against Ray for all those years, had finally been linked to Ray's murder. Not by confession, of course. He'd died years ago. No, we had to piece it together from his past, the theft, the violence, the pattern. His history with Ray was the key. And it was that grudge, small as it might have seemed in the beginning, that had spiraled into something far darker than either of them could have imagined. The final piece, the last shred of evidence that tied Garrett to Ray's death, came from a shovel, Garrett's shovel, that had been used to bury Ray. The soil matched. The bones confirmed it. Lyle Garrett couldn't stand trial, couldn't face the consequences, but the evidence was irrefutable. The district attorney declared the case closed. And yet, when I read that in the paper, when I heard the finality of those words, I felt the weight of something much heavier than just the closing of a file. Karen Mitchell had always known something wasn't right. It had taken 22 years, but she finally had the answer she'd been living with for so long. Ray hadn't just walked away. He hadn't abandoned her or disappeared into his own mind. He'd been murdered, and she had the confirmation she'd waited so long for. She was in Colorado now, close to her daughter, trying to make a new life, one that had long been overshadowed by her husband's absence. But the woman I spoke to on the phone that day when we told her about the case being solved was different. There was something in her voice that told me she was at peace with the loss, but she had come to accept that peace was something she could only hold for herself now. It had taken so much to get there, so much time spent not knowing, but at least now she could grieve with the truth in hand. I think about her a lot, Karen. I think about how she had to live with the silence, with the uncertainty for so many years. No matter how much time passes, the answers don't come back any faster. The grief doesn't ease just because you have a name, because you have the truth. It changes, sure. It settles into something new. But it doesn't go away. Ray's kids, Michelle and Tyler, were in the same place. They had both moved on in their own ways. Tyler had taken a job in Seattle, and Michelle was in Colorado with Karen. But when I spoke with Michelle after the case was closed, there was something in her voice that told me she too had been carrying a piece of that grief all along. She was relieved, of course. We all were. But it wasn't the kind of relief that filled a hole. It just made the hole a little clearer. She could finally stop asking why. She could finally look at her children and know that their grandfather's memory, her father's memory, wasn't just some mystery. What happened to Lyle Garrett in the end didn't matter to anyone but the ones who'd been left behind. There was no courtroom, no reckoning, just an old man's grave and a family who could never confront him. That's what justice sometimes looks like. It's not a neat bow, not a moment where the bad guy gets his due. Sometimes it's just pieces of the truth and the hope that they're enough to make the pain bearable. I still think about those last moments on I-80, the uncertainty in Ray's voice when he called Karen, the way his last transmission cracked through the radio, cutting off just before he could finish. "Don't follow me off the..." What had he been trying to say? Who had he been warning, and why had it been so urgent? Maybe we'll never know the full story, but I think the truth in its own way was just as revealing. We never found Lyle's motive fully explained. And maybe that's because there's no real explanation for violence like this. Some people don't need a reason other than the one they've been carrying for years. For Lyle Garrett, that reason had been buried in the past, the anger over a small theft, the simmering resentment that built over time. But for Ray Mitchell, it wasn't about why it happened. It was about who he was when it did. He was steady, reliable. He had built a life on that steadiness, and when he was taken, it left an emptiness in everyone who knew him. That's the price of the truth sometimes. It's not a clean answer. It's just a hole that never fully fills. When I stood at the site where Ray had been buried, where we had found his remains, I thought about how strange it is that time doesn't stop for anyone. Not for the families who are left behind, not for the investigators trying to piece it all together. Time just keeps moving, carrying us all along. But sometimes in the quietest moments, I hear Ray's voice. Not the voice on the CB, but the one his family remembers, a steady voice full of warmth and routine. And it reminds me that even after all the years of waiting after the questions were answered, Ray Mitchell wasn't just a name on a file. He was a father, a husband, a man who lived and worked and loved. And that's the part that stays with you. Ray's memory. His story. It lives on not just in the answers we found, but in the people who remember him. Those who loved him, who were left with a piece of him in their hearts no matter how much time has passed. And in the end, that's the legacy we leave behind, isn't it? Not the answers, but the quiet, steady pulse of who we were. The marks we made in the lives of the people who mattered. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.